Welcome back, everybody. We are now on to day 3 of Unit 4. So we're still talking about transport. And today we're going to be talking about a few different types of passive transport. So today's aim is how do molecules move across a cell membrane in passive transport? So I want us to write down what we already know about passive transport. Based on yesterday's video, you should know that passive transport does not require energy. Right? And you should also know that this is because molecules are moving from high to low concentration. So we're going to call that moving down the concentration gradient. Right? Now for our do now, you've got 2 questions. The first one is, when is the substance most likely to diffuse into a cell? And 2, does passive transport require energy? Now, I'm not actually going to tell you the answers today because based on what I just annotated from our aim, you should be able to figure it out. All right. So go ahead and make sure you answer questions 1 and 2 on your paper. But I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I already told you today's lesson is going to be all about different types of passive transport. Today we're going to learn about 3 different types. The first type of passive transport that we need to know is a word you may already be familiar with, and that is diffusion. Whenever we're talking about diffusion, we're talking about small nonpolar molecules that can just easily pass directly through that lipid bilayer. So because they're small and because they're nonpolar, which means their charge is pretty evenly balanced, so it's a pretty stable molecule. So evenly balanced charge. Those molecules can easily pass through the lipid bilayer. They don't need any extra help. They're small enough they can just go through undetected. They easily slip in between those phospholipids. Some examples of molecules that are able to do this are examples like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hormones. They are small and nonpolar enough that they can just easily fit through in between those lipid bilayers. Now, this process, because it is passive, it does not require energy, so no extra ATP is needed. And again, we are still moving from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So this is just one example of passive transport. An example of this, where do we go? Is the diffusion of oxygen into blood cells going into the lungs. So because oxygen is a small and nonpolar molecule, it's easily able to diffuse out of the cell membrane and diffuse into the cell membrane without any extra help. It is just easily diffusing through that membrane. Right, now here's a recap of what you need to know about that. Simple diffusion requires no energy, and molecules are still moving from high to low concentrations. They are moving down the concentration gradient. Right, now here's a picture of what that looks like. So at first, the molecules start out in this left-hand corner. Here, they're at a high concentration, but over time, what do we see happening? Concentration. They start spreading out all throughout this environment. They're moving to those areas of low concentration, and they're going to keep moving until there's equal amounts of molecules everywhere. And when we have equal amounts of molecules everywhere, we're going to call that equilibrium. I hope you guys can, I'm actually gonna write that in a different color. That's not pretty. Please hold. All right, let's try that one more time. Let's do it in white. So when we have equal amounts of molecules, we're going to call that equilibrium. Right, and it's no coincidence that equal and equilibrium kind of sound the same. It's because they mean the exact same thing. Equilibrium is when there's equal amounts of molecules everywhere. All right, so again, diffusion is a passive process, which means no energy is needed for this. Please don't forget that. All right, here's one more picture before we move on to the next phrase or next type of transport. Again, this is showing us diffusion, which is passive transport. Molecules are moving from an area of high concentration. Here we have a ton of these molecules, and they're moving to an area of low concentration. Over here, there's not many molecules, but over time, we want to achieve equilibrium. We want to have the same amount of molecules on each side of the cell membrane. So those molecules are going to move across from high concentration to low concentration until equilibrium is reached. Right? And we call this, again, solute is moving down the concentration gradient. So it's going from high concentration to low. I think I've said that approximately 37,000 times today. And that's because it's super, super important. So don't forget it. All right, now there is another type of diffusion. So we just talked about simple diffusion, but there's another type of diffusion that's called facilitated. Right? And this is what happens when we need ions or polar molecules to cross the cell membrane. So if you think back to today's lesson, I told you that ions, because they have that charge, remember I drew you guys a picture of Pikachu. Let's see if I can draw it again. Oop. Oh, he's kind of cute. Oh, he's not as cute as my one today, but he'll have to do. Because ions have that electrical charge, they cannot cross the membrane on their own. They get denied at the front gate. The cell membrane's like, no, you are not getting in here with that charge. But we still need ions and polar molecules inside our cells. So how do they get inside? Well, this is where our friends, the protein channels, come in. So with facilitated diffusion, ions and polar molecules, which means that there's an uneven charge, so it's going to be pretty strongly charged, they're still important for our cell function. We still need them, even though they can't diffuse through the lipid bilayer. So what has to happen here with facilitated diffusion is transport proteins have to come to the rescue. These transport proteins, like our protein channels, are going to help these ions and polar molecules cross. So they are what help these molecules diffuse through the membrane. And some examples of this are glucose and amino acids. These are polar molecules that need a little bit of extra help to get through that membrane. So they use protein channels. But again, because this is diffusion, it's still passive transport. That means that no energy is needed. And again, these proteins are still moving the molecules from high to low concentration. So it's still a type of passive transport. And an example of this is when glucose or amino acids move from the blood into the cell. So because glucose is a little bit of a bigger molecule, and because it's polar, it has an uneven charge, that means that, or an uneven distribution of charge, I should say. That means that they need a little bit of extra help to get into that cell membrane. So they have to use protein channels to get there. Right, and here is a picture of what that looks like. So here is that protein channel that we see that spans across the cell membrane. Remember I told you guys that these are kind of like tunnels that the molecules have to travel through to get to the other side. So these bigger materials, because they can't fit through the membrane here, they have to travel through the protein channel to get to the other side. So it's kind of like a secret passageway for those bigger molecules. So again, facilitated diffusion does not require energy. It uses transport proteins to move those molecules from high to low concentration. And an example of this is glucose or amino acids moving from the blood into the cell. All right. Now, the third type of transport that we're going to talk about today is something called osmosis. Now, again, this is still passive transport, so everything we've talked about still applies. But osmosis is a little bit different because with osmosis, we're only talking about the movement of water molecules. So osmosis is what allows cells to maintain water balance. So this is diffusion specifically of water across a membrane. So we're not talking about necessarily solute molecules. We're talking about just the movement of water molecules. But again, because it is passive transport, we are still moving those molecules from high concentration of water to a low concentration of water. But here's where it gets tricky. Because we're talking about water, we're not going to say concentration of. We're going to call this water potential. So it's going to move from an area of high water potential, where we have a lot of water molecules, to an area of low water potential, where we have fewer water molecules. But that also means, this is going to make more sense when I get to the next slide, so I know this is confusing. In areas where we have a high water potential, that means that we have a low amount of solute, to an area of low water potential means that we have a high solute. I know you're probably thinking, what the heck is Ms. Collins talking about? That makes no sense. But I'm going to put a pause on that question until we get to the next slide, where you guys are able to see a picture of what this looks like. Okay, but don't panic. All you need to know is that osmosis is moving from water is moving from an area of high water potential down the concentration gradient to an area of low water potential. All right, so before we go to this picture, quickly jot down these notes. Once again, osmosis is diffusion of water across the membrane, specifically just water. Water is going to keep moving across that membrane until equilibrium is reached. And we're moving from an area of high water potential to low water potential. All right, so here is that picture I promised you of what it looks like. So if you look at this diagram, the tiny blue molecules are going to be our water molecules. And the bigger green molecules are our solute molecules. That is what's dissolved into this solution. Now you may notice that these green molecules are too big to cross that membrane, but we still need to achieve equilibrium on both sides. But how do we do that if the solute can't cross the membrane? So on the left side of this membrane, we have a high water potential. There are a ton of water molecules. But we also have a low solute concentration, which means that there are only 4 molecules of this solute. There's not that much. So we have more water than we do solute. But on the right-hand side of this on this membrane, we have a low water potential. That means that there is less water on the right side. That also means that I see more green solute molecules on this right side as well. So we're going to call that the high solute concentration. Right, so on this left side, we have more water. I'm gonna write that in white. More water than solute. And over here, we have more solute than water. Okay, but the solute molecules are too big to cross membrane. So because those solute molecules are too big to cross, but we still want to achieve equilibrium, what ends up having to happen is osmosis. Because the solute molecules can't move, the water takes one for the team and he's like, I got this, guys, okay? And that water ends up going across the membrane instead. So because these green molecules can't move across the membrane, the water is going to go instead. And this side of the membrane, where there is more water than solute, those water molecules are going to move across the membrane until we have an equal amount of water to solute ratio on both sides. So it's going to keep going until equilibrium is reached. All right. The very last thing I want you guys to do today, here's another picture of what osmosis looks like, or here's an example of osmosis. Using what we just covered, I want you guys to explain or describe how water moves across this membrane during osmosis. So pay attention to the solute, the amount of solute. So these little purple dots are the solute. Okay, and the pink background is going to be our water solution. So pay attention to where those molecules are moving, where the water is moving. Tell me, how is water moving during osmosis? I'm not going to give you the answer. I want to see what you know. All right, and that is all I have for you guys today. So the only other thing you need to complete is your exit ticket. Make sure you submit that before tomorrow morning at 8:30. Let me know if you have any questions on Remind, and have a wonderful afternoon. I'll see you guys tomorrow.